The pause that settled over the Pacific at the turn of May did not signify peace. It marked recalibration. Fleets withdrew not to disengage but to rearm, to repair, to rethink a war that had grown faster than doctrine could contain. In underground bunkers from Hawaii to Hainan, analysts reconstructed timelines frame by frame, searching for the precise second when control had been lost. None could agree. The conclusion, unspoken but understood, was more disturbing. The war had not begun with a decision, it had emerged. On May 2nd, the United States formally activated the Joint Emergency Continuity Network. Portions of civilian infrastructure, ports, rail hubs, satellite uplinks were transferred to military oversight under temporary authority. The announcement was deliberately vague. Markets had already collapsed far enough. Clarity was considered a liability. Along the West Coast, National Guard units appeared at fuel depots and data centers. Longshoremen worked under armed supervision. For the first time since the Cold War, civil defense sirens were tested in San Diego and Seattle, their sound unfamiliar to a generation that had grown up without them. In Beijing, the Central Military Commission convened in permanent session. President Liu Hao no longer chaired every meeting. Operational command had shifted, quietly but decisively, to the theater commands. The Eastern and Southern fleets were instructed to prepare for a protracted conflict measured not in days, but in production cycles. Shipyards in Dalian and Guangzhou moved to 24-hour schedules. Civilian ferries were requisitioned and stripped for parts. University students in engineering programs were reassigned to state factories under emergency labor provisions. The language used was not war, but endurance. The first sign that the conflict was mutating came not from the sea, but from orbit. On May 4th, commercial satellite providers reported widespread signal degradation across the Pacific Basin. Officially, the cause was orbital congestion following recent debris events. In practice, both sides had begun aggressive maneuvering of reconnaissance platforms, masking military movements behind civilian traffic. Weather forecasts degraded. Shipping insurers suspended coverage east of the Philippines. Entire supply chains slowed, then stalled, not because of destruction, but because no one could see clearly enough to move. At sea, the fighting resumed in fragments. No grand engagements, no decisive battles. Instead, there were disappearances. A Chinese replenishment ship failed to report after transiting the Celebes Sea. An American Virginia-class submarine aborted patrol and returned to Pearl Harbor with unexplained hull scoring. Each side accused the other in classified channels, then quietly adjusted patrol routes. Losses were absorbed without announcements. Silence became a weapon. On May 6th, Taiwan became the fulcrum everyone had feared but avoided naming. Chinese air activity around the island tripled within 48 hours. Not strikes, not landings, presence. Endless orbits, simulated attack runs, electronic probing. Taiwan's Air Force responded in kind, flying until maintenance crews collapsed. The island's civilian population adapted with grim efficiency. Subway stations were stocked with water and masks. Schools shifted to remote instruction, not because of bombs, but because bandwidth had become more reliable than roads. Washington watched the escalation with a mixture of resolve and restraint. Any explicit guarantee to Taipei risked triggering the very invasion planners hoped to deter. Instead, the United States increased transit operations. Warships passed through the Taiwan Strait in daylight, broadcasting position and intent, daring response without inviting it. Each transit was filmed, analyzed, debated globally. None drew fire, yet every one tightened the spiral. On May 9th, the war expanded laterally. A cyber attack of unprecedented scale disrupted port operations in Singapore for 6 hours, halting nearly 20% of global container traffic. No attribution was claimed. Within minutes, counter-intrusions rippled through financial networks in Shenzhen and Los Angeles alike. Algorithms fought algorithms, freezing trades, rerouting data, corrupting logs. By the time human operators intervened, billions in value had vanished into accounting limbo. The front lines were no longer geographic. Inside the Pentagon, planners began using a new phrase, irreversible coupling.
Military action now triggered economic reaction, which triggered political instability, which fed back into military calculus. Every strike created second and third order effects that could not be recalled. The war was no longer something that could be paused, it could only be slowed. The first ground casualties occurred far from any declared battlefield. On May 11th, a fuel convoy in northern Luzon was ambushed while transporting aviation kerosene to a temporary U.S. airstrip. The attackers were never identified. Local militants, criminal syndicates, or proxy forces remained unclear. 12 civilians died. The Philippine government condemned the attack and requested expanded security assistance. American advisors arrived within days. China denounced the move as militarization. Southeast Asia, long a buffer, was becoming terrain. By mid-May, both Washington and Beijing faced the same private realization. Victory, as traditionally defined, was unattainable without escalation neither could control. Yet withdrawal promised something worse, strategic defeat broadcast to allies and rivals alike. The war had reached a stable instability, violent enough to bleed, restrained enough to continue. On May 14th, a rare direct communication occurred, a secure line between U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and China's Eastern Theater Command opened for exactly 7 minutes. No threats were exchanged, no concessions offered. The message was procedural, notification of an upcoming ballistic missile test in the Central Pacific, non-nuclear, intended as a systems validation. The subtext was unmistakable. We are still talking, we are still counting. That same night, under cloud cover west of Guam, an American B-21 bomber conducted the first operational sortie of the conflict. It dropped no weapons. Its purpose was presence, recorded by radar, by satellites, by every analyst who understood what its silhouette represented. China responded within hours, dispersing mobile missile units deeper inland, away from the coast, away from easy targets. Each side adjusted, learning, evolving. The war had entered its second phase, less visible, more dangerous. It no longer asked who would fire next, but who could endure longer in a system slowly grinding itself apart. And somewhere beneath the Pacific, autonomous sensors continued to listen, to classify, to prepare. Machines waiting for signals that humans were no longer certain they could interpret, let alone stop.
The second half of May marked the normalization of the unthinkable. What had shocked the world weeks earlier now settled into routine briefings, daily casualty estimates buried behind market reports and weather alerts. The war did not dominate headlines anymore. It threaded through them and assumed constant, like inflation or climate. Governments learned to speak about it without urgency, and that was perhaps the most dangerous development of all. On May 18th, the United States quietly reinstated convoy doctrine in the Pacific. Commercial vessels bound for Japan and South Korea were grouped under naval escort, their routes adjusted weekly to avoid predictable patterns. To the public, it was described as a precaution against piracy. In reality, Chinese long-range drones had begun shadowing merchant traffic, mapping logistics flows with meticulous patience. Every container ship had become a data point, every delay a vulnerability. China answered with its own adaptation. The People's Liberation Army Navy shifted emphasis from surface dominance to denial. Instead of contesting American carrier groups directly, it saturated choke points with sensor nets, autonomous underwater vehicles, seabed acoustic arrays, drifting signal buoys indistinguishable from civilian equipment. The ocean floor became contested territory. Submarine commanders on both sides reported increasing false contacts, ghost signatures generated by adversary algorithms designed to provoke hesitation or waste torpedoes. Trust in instruments eroded. Decisions relied more heavily on intuition, and intuition under stress was unreliable. On May 20th, the first confirmed engagement between autonomous systems occurred without human authorization.
A Chinese maritime drone operating near the Ryukyu Islands classified an American unmanned surface vessel as hostile based on an outdated threat library. It rammed the target at full speed, detonating its payload. The American vessel responded automatically, transmitting a burst signal that triggered defensive routines in nearby Allied drones. Within 90 seconds, 3 more unmanned craft were destroyed. No sailors were harmed, no shots were fired by human hands, yet both commands logged the event as an act of aggression. Retaliatory thresholds quietly shifted. The implications unsettled senior officers more than any missile strike. Control loops were tightening, reaction times were shrinking below the span of human deliberation. The war was accelerating toward a speed at which policy could no longer intervene. At the diplomatic level, efforts to contain the conflict multiplied, then stalled. Switzerland hosted exploratory talks that never progressed beyond agenda setting. Messages passed through intermediaries in Jakarta and Ankara, proposing confidence-building measures, notification windows, drone exclusion zones, satellite deconfliction. Each proposal collapsed under mistrust. Verification required transparency. Transparency invited exploitation. Neither side was willing to be the first to blink. On May 23rd, a miscalculation in space nearly ended the stalemate. A Chinese early warning satellite, recently repositioned to compensate for earlier losses, detected what appeared to be a clustered missile launch from the Central Pacific. Automated alerts propagated through command networks in under 3 seconds. In Beijing, readiness levels spiked. Mobile launchers rolled into firing posture. Submarine crews awaited coded release messages. 12 minutes later, analysts determined the signal had been a rare atmospheric reflection caused by a civilian rocket launch from South America, combined with debris interference. The alert was canceled. The launchers stood down. No announcement was made. The world never knew how close it had come. Inside the U.S. Strategic Command, the incident reinforced a growing fear. Escalation was no longer a ladder, it was a web. Any movement risked entanglement in paths no one fully understood. By late May, the human cost became harder to obscure. Hospitals in Okinawa reported staff shortages as reservists were called up. In coastal China, fishing villages were evacuated under the guise of disaster preparedness, their harbors requisitioned for military use. Insurance rates in the Pacific Basin rendered entire industries unviable overnight. Tens of thousands were displaced, not by bombs, but by anticipation. The first public protest against the war occurred in Los Angeles on May 27th. It was small, contained, and largely ignored. A similar gathering in Chengdu was dispersed within minutes. Both governments monitored dissent carefully, not fearing revolution, but distraction. Unity, even enforced unity, was considered a strategic asset. On May 29th, the war expanded vertically. Hypersonic glide vehicles were tested by both sides within hours of each other, each launch announced after the fact as a scheduled evaluation. Their trajectories were deliberately ambiguous, skimming the upper atmosphere before plunging into remote ocean zones. The tests served no immediate tactical purpose. They were messages, proof that the ceiling of escalation remained terrifyingly high. Naval engagements continued in the background, smaller now, but relentless. A U.S. destroyer suffered damage from a limpet mine near Palawan. A Chinese frigate was crippled by an air-launched anti-ship missile during a night patrol in the East China Sea. Each loss was acknowledged obliquely, stripped of context, folded into statistics. Families received notifications without explanations. Memorials were postponed indefinitely. By the end of May, military planners on both sides began to speak openly of a long war. Not total war, not nuclear war, but systemic war. a conflict fought across domains, sustained by inertia, resistant to resolution. The objective was no longer victory, it was relative exhaustion. The Pacific, once a boundary between worlds, had become a continuous battle space from seabed to stratosphere. Every layer was active, every layer was fragile. As June approached, analysts noted a final unsettling trend. Decision-making authority was drifting downward, not by policy, but by necessity. Captains, drone supervisors, algorithm designers all found themselves making choices with strategic consequences. The higher commands issued guidance, frameworks, principles, but the war lived in moments measured in seconds, not communiques. History had not ended, it had fragmented. And somewhere, deep within hardened data centers and quiet command rooms, systems continued to learn from every exchange, refining models, adjusting thresholds, preparing for futures their creators could no longer fully imagine.
June arrived without ceremony. There was no declaration, no turning point to mark the transition. Calendars changed. The war did not. The first week of June was defined by strain, not the visible kind, no massed strikes or burning cities, but systemic fatigue creeping through institutions designed for short, decisive conflicts. Maintenance backlogs doubled. Spare parts were cannibalized from inactive platforms. Crews rotated too quickly to recover, too slowly to remain sharp. Errors increased, subtle at first, then measurable. On June 3rd, a U.S. Navy E-2D Hawkeye operating north of Guam misclassified a formation of friendly drones returning from patrol as inbound threats. The error lasted 12 seconds before being corrected, but in that window, 2 escort fighters were vectored into intercept posture. One pilot later described the moment as standing on the edge of muscle memory, fingers already moving toward release. The incident never entered official logs. It circulated instead as a cautionary anecdote passed quietly between squadrons. China faced parallel pressures. The tempo of coastal air operations forced accelerated pilot training programs into service. New crews flew sophisticated platforms with minimal live fire experience. Simulation compensated for some gaps, but not all. On June 5th, a J-20 experienced a fatal systems failure during a high-G maneuver off the Shandong Peninsula. The aircraft disintegrated mid-air. The loss was attributed to mechanical fault. Internally, investigators noted that the pilot had exceeded recommended parameters while responding to a phantom radar contact. The ghosts were multiplying. That same week, the information environment shifted decisively. Both governments abandoned attempts at narrative dominance and moved instead toward narrative suppression. International journalists were embedded, restricted, rotated. Independent footage from the Pacific became rare, then non-existent. What images did surface were heavily mediated, grainy infrared clips, distant missile plumes, anonymous silhouettes. The war took on an abstract quality, paradoxically making it easier to ignore and harder to oppose. On June 7th, an event occurred that would later be recognized as the beginning of the third phase of the conflict, economic targeting. A coordinated cyber-financial operation disrupted currency settlement systems across multiple Asian markets for nearly 48 hours. No accounts were wiped, no balances erased. Instead, transactions stalled, confirmations delayed, trust undermined. The effect rippled outward. Factories paused, shipping queues lengthened, insurance clauses were triggered en masse. The operation bore hallmarks of both state-level planning and autonomous execution. Attribution was impossible, responsibility was irrelevant. The message was clear: stability itself was now a target. In Washington, emergency meetings focused less on China and more on allies. Japan requested expanded missile defense coverage. Australia asked for reassurances regarding trade routes. European partners pressed for de-escalation, even as they quietly increased defense readiness. The alliance network held, but tension accumulated along its seams. Every commitment carried cost. Every hesitation carried risk. Beijing faced a different dilemma.
Domestic control remained firm, but economic indicators flashed warning signals. Energy imports slowed, insurance premiums on maritime shipping strained state subsidies. Provincial leaders requested exemptions, adjustments, relief. The central government responded selectively, prioritizing regions tied directly to war production. Inequality, long managed, began to sharpen. The leadership understood the danger. Wars were not only lost at the front. On June 10th, the most serious naval incident since April unfolded in the Philippine Sea. A Chinese submarine, operating under revised autonomous engagement protocols, detected what it assessed as a high-value surface combatant. The contact was in reality an American hospital ship transiting under full illumination, its markings unmistakable to human eyes. The submarine's targeting solution did not incorporate visual confirmation. It prepared to fire. The launch was aborted at the last possible moment, not by algorithm, but by a human commander overriding the system. The torpedoes remained in their tubes. The submarine withdrew. The hospital ship continued on course, unaware of how narrowly disaster had been avoided. The incident was reported up the chain. It triggered the first serious internal debate in Beijing over autonomous weapons governance since the war began. Some argued the systems were essential, that human hesitation invited defeat. Others warned that the margin for error was collapsing. No formal policy changed, but a quiet directive followed. Commanders were encouraged to exercise judgment. In a war defined by speed, judgment was becoming a scarce resource. Mid-June brought a new escalation vector, space denial below the threshold of destruction. Instead of destroying satellites outright, both sides began interfering with them, blinding sensors temporarily, nudging orbits subtly, corrupting data streams. The effect was cumulative. Navigation errors increased, weather models diverged, missile warning times shortened unpredictably. Each side blamed the other for instability neither fully controlled. On June 14th, a commercial airliner flying from Sydney to Tokyo was forced to divert after losing reliable navigation signals over the Western Pacific. No passengers were harmed. The incident made global news. For the first time, the war intruded directly into civilian life far from any battlefield. Airlines began rerouting flights en masse. Travel times increased. Costs rose. The sense of distance collapsed. Public opinion shifted accordingly. In the United States, polls showed declining confidence not in the military, but in the possibility of resolution. In China, state media emphasized resilience, patience, historical inevitability. Different narratives, same undercurrent. Endurance had replaced hope. As June drew toward its midpoint, both sides prepared contingency plans they prayed would remain unused. Nuclear forces remained officially separate from the conflict, but exercises increased. Communication channels were tested, then tested again. Each test reassured and alarmed in equal measure. The war had not escalated into apocalypse, it had metastasized into permanence. And permanence, strategists knew, was often more corrosive than catastrophe.
The last weeks of June unfolded without climax, and that absence itself became the defining feature of the war's next stage. No capitals burned, no flags were raised over conquered ground. Instead, the conflict settled into something colder and more abstract, a condition rather than an event. On June 21st, the summer solstice passed unnoticed across most of the Northern Hemisphere. In the Pacific, it marked the longest continuous period of global military tension without formal declaration in modern history. Forces on both sides remained forward deployed, yet increasingly static. Fuel consumption fell, sortie rates declined, not because of diplomacy, but because systems were reaching their operational limits. The machines had adapted faster than the people. Autonomous logistics software rerouted supplies around damaged ports. Predictive maintenance algorithms decided which ships were worth repairing and which were not. Commanders began receiving recommendations rather than options. Probability-weighted courses of action calculated faster than any staff could debate them. Many followed the advice without comment. Others resisted, insisting on human judgment even as the data suggested otherwise.
On June 24th, a classified U.S. assessment reached the National Security Council with a blunt conclusion: continued escalation would no longer be linear. Any significant strike now carried a non-negligible probability of strategic weapons release, not by intent, but by cascade. A similar report circulated within China's Central Military Commission the same week, reaching nearly identical conclusions through entirely different models. For the first time since April, both sides independently arrived at the same fear. What followed was not peace, but attenuation. Patrol zones were adjusted to reduce overlap by margins measured in miles, then fractions of miles. Missile readiness postures were quietly lowered, never announced, never acknowledged. Cyber operations shifted from disruption to surveillance. The war did not stop, it exhaled. On June 27th, an unremarkable meeting took place in a secure facility outside Geneva. No flags were displayed, no joint statements prepared. Representatives spoke in conditional language, carefully avoiding words like ceasefire or truce. The discussion centered on mechanisms, how to prevent unintended, irreversible outcomes. It was the language of engineers, not diplomats. When the meeting ended, nothing had been signed. Yet within days, analysts noticed patterns changing. The Pacific grew quieter. Ships still sailed, aircraft still flew, satellites still maneuvered, but engagements became rarer, more cautious. Autonomous systems were reparameterized with wider tolerances. Human override thresholds were restored in key domains. The war receded from the edge, not because anyone pushed it back, but because both sides recognized how little control they truly had left. By the end of June, global markets stabilized at lower levels. Shipping resumed along narrower corridors. Civil aviation cautiously expanded routes. The world adjusted, as it always did, to a new baseline of risk. Historians would later debate when the Third World War truly began and whether it ever fully happened at all. There was no declaration to cite, no single day to commemorate, only a span of weeks when the systems that governed the world were tested under stress and revealed to be more fragile and more economous than anyone had intended. The Pacific Ocean returned outwardly to calm. Beneath its surface lay wreckage, sensor grids, dormant drones, and the quiet memory of how close the world had come to losing the ability to choose. Deterrence had not failed. It had evolved into something colder, quieter, and far less forgiving. When the war receded from the headlines, it did not disappear. It embedded itself into the architecture of the future, waiting.